The Brothers Grimm were spies, not storytellers. They taught us that Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm were nothing more than harmless old men with spectacles and soft voices, scribbling down fairy tales told by peasant grandmothers around the fire. They told us the brothers wandered from village to village, collecting fables whispered from generation to generation, honest stories from simple folk meant to entertain and preserve German heritage. They painted the Brothers Grimm as the kindly fathers of bedtime storytelling, cultural preservationists, sweet intellectuals who simply wanted to save the past. But what they never told us is this: the Brothers Grimm were spies, and not just ordinary spies. They were cultural operatives, part of one of the most sophisticated psychological campaigns of the 19th century. Their mission? Not to collect fairy tales, but to reshape a fractured Germany through myth, language, and coded stories. Because Germany, as we know it today, didn't exist when the Brothers Grimm walked the earth. It was a chaotic cluster of over 300 kingdoms, duchies, and principalities, all competing for dominance, all wrestling with the fallout of Napoleon's collapse and the crumbling Holy Roman Empire. There was no Germany. Only 1,000 identities, dialects, rivalries, and blood feuds stretching back centuries. If you wanted to unite it all, you couldn't do it with brute force. You'd need something far stronger, something invisible, something that sinks into the minds of children and grows with them, something like a story. Jacob Grimm was the first to be recruited, and it wasn't through a shadowy back door in Berlin, but through academia. As a law student at the University of Marburg, Jacob was brought into elite legal circles under the Kingdom of Westphalia, a client state of Napoleon at the time. But when Westphalia collapsed, Jacob, unlike many others, didn't lose his footing. He pivoted, fast. Suddenly, he was being offered access to archives, noble libraries, and rare documents that would be impossible for any common scholar to see. Why? Because someone wanted him to see them. They wanted him to build something that would unify a splintered people not through law or war, but through culture. His younger brother Wilhelm soon joined him, and together, the Brothers Grimm began collecting. But not randomly. Their collection focused almost exclusively on what would later be known as Germanic moral structure. Stories of order and disorder, tales where disobedience is punished, innocence is restored, outsiders are evil, and the natural order, the kingdom, the family, the patriarchy, is restored in the end. These weren't just bedtime stories, they were manuals for how to think, how to behave, and who to fear. In 1812, when they published the first edition of Kinder- und Hausmärchen, Children's and Household Tales, the pretense was innocent. But dig deeper into the preface and footnotes, and you'll find something strange. The brothers insisted on the purity of German folk tales. They claimed the need to filter out foreign contamination. They edited the tales to remove any hints of French, Slavic, or even Christian overlays that might distract from a true German voice. And then, quietly, they began building something even bigger, a linguistic map. The Grimms didn't just publish stories. They published a massive body of work on philology, the study of how languages evolve. They traced German words back centuries, showing how dialects evolved and split across regions. But this wasn't just linguistic curiosity. This was data gathering. By mapping out dialects and linguistic traditions, the Brothers Grimm were identifying who belonged where, what cultural values lived in each village, and how to best manipulate the emotional core of each region. Because in a fragmented pre-Germany, language was power. The people didn't share kings or borders, but they shared stories. And whoever controlled the stories controlled the future. So the Grimms began rewriting them. Most of their stories were not transcribed word for word from peasants. Many came from educated middle-class women, aristocratic salons, or even previously published works. But the brothers stripped away those markers. They made the tales sound older, rougher, simpler, more German. They removed names that sounded French or Latin. They added violence, made the punishments harsher, turned tales of cleverness into lessons in obedience. Cinderella's prince doesn't love her for her wit. He loves her because she is good and quiet and pure. Snow White isn't a tale of jealousy. It's a warning about vanity, about not questioning your place. Hansel and Gretel isn't just a story of survival. It's a tale that says the forest, the unknown, the foreign, is where death lives. Even more revealing are the stories that were left out. The Grimms collected dozens of tales involving revolution, peasant uprising, or role reversals, where the servant becomes king, where the poor outsmart the rich. But most of those stories were buried, excluded, or rewritten to favor traditional hierarchy. Why? Because by the 1820s, Prussia was watching, and they liked what they saw. The Grimm tales were spreading fast, not just across Germany, but across Europe. They became textbooks of morality, ways to teach children how to behave, who to trust, and where to place their loyalty. The brothers were offered university posts, paid research positions, even roles in the Prussian civil service. And while they kept up the image of gentle scholars, their correspondence tells a darker story. Letters between Jacob Grimm and other nationalist thinkers reveal an obsession with using culture to reshape power. He writes about correcting the myths, restoring the original soul of the German people. He speaks of cleansing the stories from the French rot that had seeped in during Napoleon's rule. This wasn't just about stories. This was about psychological warfare, about planting seeds that would blossom into nationalist pride, cultural unity, and, one day, political allegiance. And the Brothers Grimm weren't the only ones doing it. Across Europe, other so-called folklorists were performing similar missions, in Finland, in Italy, in Russia. Language and story had become the quiet battlefield of empire. The British used colonial tales to justify rule. The Russians rewrote folk epics to place the Tsar as divine. And in the middle of it all, two brothers sat in a quiet study, rewriting the world through parchment and ink. But they didn't stop there. When revolution threatened Europe in 1848, the Grimms were already revered. Their books had become cultural scripture. So when the German unification movement began to boil, the idea of turning all the tiny states into one great nation, who do you think they turned to for ideological ammunition? The men who had spent 40 years defining Germanness. The Brothers Grimm weren't just storytellers anymore. They were cultural architects, political engineers. The fairy tales, they were just the front. The real story was hidden behind the words, and the world never saw it coming. The story you were never told is that while Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm became famous for fairy tales, their true obsession, the one that consumed their nights and swallowed their names into the state's most secret documents, was not storytelling. It was language. And not just any language. They believed the German language itself was a weapon, a map, a line of blood that could separate friend from enemy, truth from corruption, identity from obliteration. Because for the Brothers Grimm, every dialect, every folk phrase, every strange word passed down through generations wasn't just a curiosity, it was a marker, a trace of the old world, before kings, before invaders, before religion. They believed language was the only untouched thread linking modern people to their ancestral roots. But it wasn't just about history, it was about power. Because if you could prove a word was authentically German, then you could claim the people who spoke it, their town, their land, their loyalty. That was the real goal behind their greatest and most secretive work, Deutsches Wörterbuch, the largest German dictionary ever attempted. Most people think it was an academic project, but they don't know it was commissioned in 1838, not by a university, but by the Kingdom of Prussia. And it wasn't meant to sit on a shelf. It was meant to be used by military officers, census takers, and cultural inspectors to determine who belonged and who didn't. Because language, to the Prussian state, wasn't just a tool of communication, it was a test, a kind of surveillance. And the Grimms were building the rubric. Every word in the dictionary was traced backward, not just to its etymological root, but to its region, its original speaker, its cultural weight. Was it spoken by peasants or nobles? Was it tainted by Latin or French? Was it used in Catholic or Protestant territories? Behind every definition was a data point, a political classification, a hidden flag. In private letters, Jacob Grimm even suggested that language could be used to define borders more accurately than maps. He wrote that, "Where a people's tongue ends, there their land ends also." That may sound poetic, but what he meant was terrifying. He meant that Prussia could redraw the boundaries of Europe, not with armies, but with dictionaries. Imagine an inspector walks into your village and asks you a simple question. What do you call the wooden handle of a scythe? If you say Griff, you might be counted as Prussian. If you say Handhaken, you're Bavarian. If you say Manil, you might be Polish-German. And if your answer doesn't fit the Grimm-approved word list, your town might be marked as foreign, disloyal, or even suspect. This wasn't just linguistic curiosity, it was a cultural audit. And it went deeper than anyone expected. Because around 1840, something changed. The Grimm brothers stopped just collecting. They started classifying people. In the margins of their notebooks next to word entries, you'll find odd marks, red circles, black lines, a system of coded annotations. Later, decoded by researchers, these marks appear to indicate levels of Germanness. Entire communities were being rated based on how well their vocabulary matched the Grimm standard. They were building a purity index, and the consequences were brutal. By 1850, Prussian authorities began pushing cultural standardization across the fractured German territories. Schools were told to abandon regional dialects. Teachers were ordered to instruct children in High German, the clean version favored by the Grimms. Books written in local tongues were removed. Tales with foreign phrasing were rewritten. Suddenly, entire generations were being stripped of their ancestral voices, all in the name of unity. But unity for whom? Because as the dictionary grew, it also excluded. Jewish words were marked as other. Yiddish phrases were omitted entirely. Slavic roots were flagged. French-sounding idioms were annotated with caution. The Grimms, who once claimed to be collecting the voice of the people, were now actively filtering them, sanitizing the language, rewriting identity. And the fairy tales? They followed suit. In the early editions, Grimm stories were more raw, more diverse. But by the mid-century reprints, many tales had been cleaned. Jewish characters were erased. Foreign villains were exaggerated. Stories that once celebrated cleverness and resistance began to favor obedience and punishment. Cinderella no longer outsmarts her tormentors. She waits to be saved. Hansel and Gretel no longer steal from the witch. They are victims, rescued only by divine fate. The message was clear. The world was dangerous, change was deadly, and safety lay in tradition. But not everyone was fooled. By 1852, other scholars began whispering about the Grimm's darker purpose. A rival linguist, Dr. August Schleicher, wrote in private that the Brothers Grimm were not folklorists, but cultural spies in a paper cloak. He claimed their dictionary was being used to marginalize rural minorities and erase linguistic independence. He warned that a weapon was being built, and it didn't use bullets. It used syllables. Meanwhile, across Germany, tensions were rising. The unification movement had turned from intellectual debate into street protests. Kingdoms were rising and falling overnight, and everywhere people were quoting Grimm tales. Teachers, priests, soldiers. The stories had become gospel, not just because they were beautiful, but because they had been weaponized. The Brothers Grimm had succeeded in creating a language of control, a mythology of loyalty, and they had done it so subtly that no one noticed until it was too late. But the cost was coming for them, too. In the late 1850s, as Wilhelm grew ill and Jacob tried to continue the dictionary alone, rumors began to surface that the Grimms had ties to secret royal councils, that some of their source materials had come from restricted archives, never meant for public view. And then, in 1863, a letter was discovered in a Prussian records office, unsigned, coded, and partially burned, that appeared to reference a linguistic standardization operation led by J.G. under cultural pretense. J.G. Jacob Grimm. The state began to pull away. The funding slowed. The letters stopped. And Jacob Grimm, once beloved, was quietly forced out of political favor. His death in 1863 went uncelebrated by the Crown. No national funeral, no academic parade, just a quiet burial and a dictionary still unfinished. But the damage had been done. The language had been restructured. The stories had spread. The borders were being redrawn not by guns, but by the very words people used to describe their world. And behind it all, two old brothers had vanished into legend, remembered only as the kindly creators of fairy tales, not as the men who helped build a nation from the shadows. By the time the Grimm fairy tales reached their third reprinting, something strange began to emerge, not just in the tone or language, but in the structure of the stories themselves. Scholars, decades later, would remark that the Grimm tales read less like folklore and more like carefully designed fables with surgical precision. Every detail had a pattern. Every character had a function. Every punishment, every reward, every rule broken and restored, all seemed to follow an invisible blueprint. But it wasn't until the coded transmissions of World War I and II were uncovered that researchers realized how far back narrative encryption went, and how central the Brothers Grimm had been to it. At first glance, Little Red Riding Hood seems like a simple tale. A girl disobeys her mother, speaks to a stranger, and nearly gets herself eaten. But look closer. The path through the woods isn't just a metaphor for temptation. It mirrors the old Thuringian merchant route. The wolf, not merely a predator, but a symbol used in early Prussian pamphlets to represent Napoleonic infiltration. The grandmother's house, a stand-in for the vulnerable, unguarded German provinces. The moral wasn't just about obedience. It was a coded warning against cross-border complacency and foreign alliances. Then there's Snow White. The mirror isn't magic, it's surveillance. The Queen's obsession with appearances wasn't vanity. It was a metaphor for court politics, where rulers feared rebellion and every threat came cloaked in beauty. The dwarves. Not whimsical miners, but representations of the regional guilds and lower castes who held hidden power outside royal watch. And Snow White herself? A model of national innocence, docile, unquestioning, betrayed by the foreign stepmother, but saved only when restored to traditional order, through marriage to a native prince. Even more striking is Hansel and Gretel. Breadcrumbs, ovens, and candy aside, it's a perfect allegory of internal displacement. Families forced to abandon their children during famine, economic collapse, or cultural threat. But the witch's house? A trap of indulgence, a structure that lures with sweetness but enslaves with fire. The tale was edited from earlier versions to exaggerate this trap, warning children not just about strangers, but about comforts offered by those who seemed too good, too generous, too foreign. And these stories weren't isolated. The Brothers Grimm, over their long careers, inserted dozens of these layered messages. Not in a grand conspiracy, but in a slow, deliberate operation that began to reshape the national mind. Prussian officers later admitted to using fairy tales as part of education programs for conscripts, embedding moral lessons into their military ethos. Even during the 1860s Austro-Prussian War, small pocket-sized versions of Grimm tales were distributed to soldiers, filled with stories of loyalty, sacrifice, and the danger of outside influence. But the most dangerous use of the tales wouldn't come until decades after the Grimms were gone. It came in the 1930s, when a man with a mustache and a nationalist fever dream rediscovered their stories. Adolf Hitler loved the Grimms. His propaganda minister, Joseph Goebbels, reprinted the tales under state license with revisions and endorsements. Entire portions of the Nazi youth curriculum were built around them. The German boy must be like Hansel, clever, strong, and obedient, they declared. The German girl must be like Cinderella, pure, patient, and ready to serve the fatherland. In these retellings, foreign characters became more grotesque. Villains with hooked noses and dark skin tones were emphasized. Native characters were simplified, cleaner, paler, always triumphant in the end. The forests grew darker. The morals became absolute. There was no ambiguity, no cleverness, just submission to order, faith in blood, and the cruel lesson that those who disobeyed always burned. And yet, most terrifying of all, these propaganda versions weren't far from the originals. The bones were already there. The edits were already made. Goebbels didn't have to invent the messages. He just turned up the volume. And here's where it gets real for all of us, because the world still hasn't turned it down. We read the stories. We teach them to children. We remake them into cartoons and musicals. We tell ourselves they're harmless. But have you ever asked yourself why every Grimm story has a simple, absolute moral? Why the heroes are passive and the villains are powerful? Why the outsiders are always dangerous and the solution is always to return to what was? Because they were designed that way. They were blueprints for building order out of chaos, stories engineered to shape young minds, to filter behavior, and to teach fear through allegory. And once you see that pattern, you start to see the power. You realize that fairy tales aren't just entertainment. They're architecture, psychological architecture, built to last for generations, built to be memorized, internalized, and repeated over and over until we can't remember where the story ends and our instincts begin. And if this kind of truth hits different, if you're seeing those bedtime stories in a way you never imagined, now's the time to drop a comment below and tell us what stories shaped you growing up. Hit the like button if you're ready to never see fairy tales the same way again. And if you haven't yet, subscribe to Uncle Luke Tells, because the stories we tell you, they'll change how you see the whole world. And that's no fairy tale. Now back to the story behind the story. Even after their deaths, the Grimm brothers continued to whisper through history. Their dictionary, Deutsches Wörterbuch, was used for decades after the war to standardize German across multiple regions. The fairy tales remained state-approved literature well into the 1950s. And even today, most German schools teach versions of their stories, scrubbed of political implications, but still carrying the same old messages beneath the surface. But what if that was the whole point? What if the Brothers Grimm knew their influence wouldn't end with one century or one regime? What if their plan was bigger? Not to serve one government, but to create a system of mental control that would outlive them? Not overt brainwashing, not loud declarations, just simple, beautiful, terrifying stories. Read at just the right age, just the right moment, to sink into your roots. Because once you've grown up on fear disguised as folklore, you never quite stop living in the woods. You never stop looking over your shoulder, and you never stop believing the old lie, that if you're just good enough, quiet enough, obedient enough, someone will come save you. The Grimms wrote that fantasy into our blood. But maybe, just maybe, it's time we rewrote the ending. Not every Grimm story made it to the bookshelves. Not every tale collected by Jacob and Wilhelm saw the light of day. Some were too strange, others too rebellious, and a few far too truthful. These were the stories whispered only in coded letters, referenced in their unpublished drafts, or locked inside personal journals that historians lost in state archives. Because while the Brothers Grimm spent decades building the myth of the obedient hero and the punishing moral, they also stumbled upon stories that did the opposite. Tales that undermined kings, mocked priests, and celebrated the poor who overthrew their masters. And those stories, they disappeared. Let's start with one that was almost published. The Servant Who Wore the Crown. Found in Wilhelm's handwritten notes but never released. This tale tells of a palace servant who discovers the royal family has long been dead. But the guards and nobles continue pretending the king is alive, issuing commands from behind a curtain. The servant, confused but clever, steps behind the veil and becomes the king, issuing new rules, freeing the workers, and redistributing land to the poor. The tale ends with a line. And though the crown was hollow, the people filled it with truth. Too dangerous. The story never appeared in any of the printed volumes. No records of its source were kept. The idea that power was a performance, that anyone could claim the throne and rewrite the rules, didn't fit the narrative Prussia wanted. That story wasn't folklore. It was a revolution in disguise. Then there was The Two Fathers, another suppressed tale found in fragments. In it, a poor man and a rich man each have a son. One day, the rich man's child goes missing. The village accuses the poor man's son, and without trial, the boy is executed. Years later, the missing child returns, having run away to join a traveling theater, and the truth is revealed. But the villagers don't apologize. They justify the execution, claiming it maintained order. The poor man curses the town, and his words become a plague, literally. The last line reads, "Truth arrived too late, and order swallowed the sun." This story was deeply feared, not just for its critique of injustice, but for its moral ambiguity. The Grimms, known for clear-cut punishments and neat endings, never allowed this tale into their official collections. Why? Because it questioned the very foundation of justice. It asked what good it is to obey when the system itself is broken. And that idea was radioactive. Another tale erased almost entirely was The Girl Who Chose the Forest. A young noblewoman, offered a life of riches and marriage to a prince, instead runs into the woods and learns from animals, witches, and spirits. She becomes a healer, a protector, and a queen of the wild. The villagers revere her, and the kingdom begins to fade as more people join her in the forest. The moral? Some queens build kingdoms of stone, others build kingdoms of freedom. This tale appeared in the earliest drafts of the Grimm manuscripts, but was stripped out before publication. The idea of a woman rejecting royal marriage, rejecting obedience, and building a free society in the wild was too much. Especially for a nation trying to teach girls to be obedient wives and patient daughters. Freedom in this story wasn't a reward given by a prince. It was a choice, and that terrified the regime. But the most haunting of all the suppressed tales may have been The Silent Room. It was found decades later, scribbled in Jacob's personal shorthand, and decoded by a linguist who believed it was the key to understanding Grimm censorship. In this story, a man enters a house where every room tells a different version of his life. One where he is king, one where he is poor, one where he is dead. In the final room, there is no reflection, no sound, only silence. A mirror shows no image. A voice whispers, "This is the room they will not let you see." The meaning? Unclear, but powerful. It suggested that reality is a construction. A narrative we're given, and only silence, absence, allows us to see beyond it. The tale didn't fit any known structure. It broke the Grimm pattern. It was a glitch in the matrix they'd helped build. And it was buried. Historians have long debated how many such stories were collected and destroyed. Some estimate dozens. Others believe it was in the hundreds, gathered during travels recorded from rebels, written down in secret, and then discarded when they contradicted the official story. Because the Brothers Grimm, as loyal as they were to the project of cultural unity, were still scholars. They knew what they were hiding. They knew the richness and the danger of the tales they were scrubbing clean. In letters between the brothers, there are hints, references to stories too bitter for public mouth, or tales that unmake the spell. Wilhelm once wrote, "There are truths not fit for empire, only the forest can carry them." And yet, ironically, many of these banned stories survived, not in books but in song, gossip, and oral retellings, passed down by women, rebels, and outcasts. In some rural parts of Germany and Eastern Europe, versions of the girl who chose the forest still exist, though the heroine is now called a witch or a demon. In some Slavic borderlands, the Two Fathers is told as a cautionary tale about blind loyalty. The people remembered what the state tried to erase. Because stories, even when burned, leave ash in the soil, and the people who planted them knew where to find the seeds again. It's no coincidence that these suppressed tales share common traits. They challenge hierarchy, celebrate rebellion, praise cleverness over obedience, and end not with marriage or punishment, but with freedom, justice, or uncertainty. And these were the exact qualities the state feared, because they could spark not just thought, but action. And what does it say about the fairy tales we know today that these stories were erased? That we've spent centuries reading only the versions that served a purpose? To tame us, to train us, to quiet us. What does it say about our education, our culture, that we remember Cinderella's slipper but not the servant who became king? The stories we're told shape our limits, and the ones we're not told, they shape our possibilities. So maybe the real fairy tale isn't about glass shoes or poisoned apples. Maybe it's the lie we were sold, that stories are harmless, that bedtime is safe, that the book is closed, and the truth has already been written. But now you know it hasn't, because the erased tales still whisper through time. And if you listen closely, if you sit quietly by the edge of the woods where the fires have long gone cold, you might just hear them again. If you were to walk through a European museum today, or even a modern library, you'd see the Brothers Grimm displayed like old wizards of childhood. Jacob and Wilhelm, gentle men with solemn eyes, holding ink pens and surrounded by fairy dust, a photo, a statue, a commemorative plaque. A reminder of how stories used to be shared by candlelight, whispered across generations. But beneath the museum glass, behind the smiling portraits and the shelves of printed tales, lies the real kingdom they built. A kingdom not made of stone or silver, but of language, of memory, of manipulation. Because Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm didn't just record stories, they helped write the psychological code of a nation. One that lives on not in thrones or flags, but in classrooms, bedtime rituals, cartoons, and even national identity itself. And once you understand what they did, you begin to realize we're still living inside their invention. The Germany of the 19th century was a splintered place, a battlefield of dialects, tribes, shifting loyalties, and deep ancestral divides. Napoleon's collapse left a vacuum, and into that chaos, a new idea was born. Unification not by force, but by myth. It wasn't armies that stitched Germany together. It was words, songs, folk tales, a shared imagination. And at the heart of that imagination stood the Grimms, quietly organizing what to remember and what to forget. The dictionary they built, the tales they rewrote, the morals they reinforced, all of it fed into the larger project of German nationalism. A project that would be hijacked and twisted by future regimes, but that began with something seemingly harmless, a storybook. And that's the genius of it. You don't need to declare war to conquer a people. You just need to convince them they've always belonged to the same tale. But the true legacy of the Brothers Grimm isn't confined to Germany. It spread. Their model of cultural engineering became a blueprint for modern propaganda across the globe. In the Soviet Union, fairy tales were repurposed by the state to elevate the worker, demonize the bourgeoisie, and encode obedience into children's fables. In America during the 1950s, anti-communist allegories crept into films, books, and cartoons, complete with wicked witches dressed like red threats and noble cowboys defending moral truth. In China's Cultural Revolution, folklore was burned, rewritten, and selectively reintroduced to reinforce the approved narrative. The tactic remained the same. Take control of the stories, and you take control of the people. And while the world pretended the Grimms were relics of the past, their methods were quietly being studied. In military think tanks, in political communications, in corporate advertising, yes, even in marketing. Because once corporations realized that stories shape behavior, they followed the Grimm formula. Brands became heroes, rivals became villains, products became magical objects promising transformation. Apple, Nike, Disney, each one building its own moral universe, a fairy tale for the modern consumer. And the most terrifying part? We welcomed it. We bought the myth. We wore the cape. And speaking of Disney, their most profitable empire began with Grimm Bones. Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, released in 1937, became a worldwide phenomenon. But it wasn't the original story. It was a sanitized, simplified, Americanized version of what the Grimms had already rewritten. The poison apple remained. The evil queen remained. The passive, sleeping girl remained. But gone were the darker undertones, the metaphors, the moral complexities. What was left was the perfect product, a tale you could market to children and adults alike, with clear roles, clear rules, and a guaranteed ending. Sound familiar? That's the Grimm legacy. A world where stories aren't meant to challenge, but to comfort. Not to awaken, but to lull. A world where disobedient characters die, and those who follow the path are saved. A world where good is quiet and evil is loud, where forests are scary and kings are always right. And yet, deep beneath that legacy, there remains something the Grimms couldn't erase, something even they couldn't control. Because for every tale they published, another tale slipped past the censors, survived in whispers, danced in kitchens, lived in old women's songs, the forbidden stories, the broken heroes, the wild queens and clever peasants who didn't wait to be rescued, but rescued themselves. They lived even after the ink dried. They survived even when history tried to silence them. And today, they're rising again. You see it in the new storytellers, the authors, filmmakers, podcasters, and creators who are digging back into the past and pulling out the stories that were buried. Stories of rebellion, of questions, not answers, of endings that aren't tied in bows. You see it in children who reject the princess myth, in adults who reread the tales and see the messages hiding in plain sight. You see it every time someone asks, "Why does the girl always have to be saved? Why is the witch always wrong? Why does the story end when the prince says it does?" You see it every time the spell begins to crack. And that's where we return to the Brothers Grimm, not to vilify them, not to sanctify them, but to see them clearly. As men who helped build a world through stories, and who understood better than anyone that stories are not innocent. They are weapons, they are maps, they are traps, they are freedom. And depending on who tells them and who listens, they can either preserve the world as it is or open the door to something new. So what now? Now you know. Now you've seen behind the ink. You've heard the truth behind the bedtime tales. The real spell has been broken, and there's no going back. But maybe that's the point. Maybe fairy tales were never meant to put us to sleep. Maybe they were warnings. Maybe they were blueprints. Maybe they were fires waiting to be lit again. And if you're feeling that fire, if you want more stories that peel back history and expose the power beneath the pages, you know what to do. Uncle Luke is here to tell you the tales they buried, and we're just getting started.